Encounter with possible backpacker murder in Australia in the 80s. This is my mom and dad's story. It was their honeymoon. They married in August 1980 in Australia, and they were driving along the Bruce Highway into a city called Rockhampton, Queensland. It was late at night, around 8 p.m.-ish, and they had been driving most of the day. There's a very long stretch of road before you come into the city that is just bush, kilometers of it. At night, the bush can be very scary. They had not passed cars for some time, probably an hour or two. Out of nowhere, headlights appeared a long way behind them, in their rearview mirror. That's fine, whatever. They keep driving as normal. Then the headlights start getting closer and closer. Dad is driving and saying something like, "What a bloody turkey. Look how fast he's driving." The car comes up right to them, with their high beam on, and follows them for about 5 minutes like that. Mom and Dad have a conversation about why the person can't just overtake them. Then the car completely backs off, like slows right down almost to a complete stop, and hangs back about 1 or 2 kilometers away for a good 10 to 15 minutes. Mom and Dad both think that was super weird and creepy, but whatever. They just keep driving. Then the car speeds up again, tailgating, high beam, and sort of swerving into the lane as if to get to overtake them. This goes on for another 5-ish minutes. Mom and Dad are both really scared now. Remember, this is the days before mobile cell phones, and besides, there had not been no reception in that area to call for help even if they had them. It's not over yet. The car backs off again, but not as far as before. The car hangs back there for about a minute before hitting the gas and absolutely flying past Mom and Dad and finally overtaking them. There appears to be one person in the car, but they couldn't really see what they looked like. There is also no number plate on the car to identify it. And I know Dad has told me heaps of times before. I can actually remember what sort of car it was now. I feel like it was sort of a sedan thing, definitely white, I don't know. And the car disappears up the road, as if it was never even there. Mom and Dad are shaken to their core but pleased it was seemingly over. Not done yet. The road now becomes a bit more windy. Previously it had been straight almost. Mom and Dad comes around a corner, and the car is parked in the middle of the road, facing them high beams on. Both driver and passenger door wide open, and the man, they could see now it was a man, standing in front of the car with his arms spread wide, spread as if to make them stop the car. Mom was screaming at Dad, "Just hit him! Don't stop! Just hit him!" And my dad, being the bloody hero that he is, did not stop and drove around the man's car on the right-hand side of it, which would be the passenger side, as if it was parked facing them. The man tried to get in front of Dad, I assume, to stop him from driving off, as he made his maneuver, but couldn't quite get there in time. He was very close to the car, and Dad nearly hit him. Dad absolutely floored it to get away from the man. They aren't sure how long they drove like that for, but they didn't slow back down to the speed limit until they started to come into the city limits. They made it to their hotel and parked the car at the back of the hotel. Mom was quite hysterical and told the reception lady what had happened. They called the police and reported it, but they never found the car or the driver. Nearly done. Fast forward many years later, Mom was watching the news and Ivan Millett had just been arrested. Mom screamed and called Dad into the lounge room. They both agreed it was the man they saw. They were absolutely adamant. I can't find evidence to suggest Ivan Millett was active in Queensland during that time, but I certainly won't call Mom and Dad liars because of what they saw. I imagine it was another creepy hillbilly who looked very similar to Mr. Backpacker Murderer. The classmate that I picked up because it was raining. This happened in 1984. I lived in a small college town that was at a stop sign when I noticed a classmate standing in the rain. I opened the door for him and drove him where he needed to be on campus. I knew him as he was in one of our classes. I talked to him sometimes in the class. I expressed sympathy when he told me about being beaten up by security officers and forced to stand in the road with his hands out and one leg up because he wanted to visit a woman who lived in what I believed to be a gated community, or was in a community which had high security presence. He was also beaten by these officers. He lived in a neighboring country, or a neighboring province, can't remember what it was. and if he indeed had a relationship with this woman, or if this woman was his girlfriend, would have been risky for both of them. In this area of the world, it was not unusual for security officers or other officers of the law to use deadly force against the citizens, and he was lucky in this case that they didn't do this to him, which they had against others. I don't remember how much time had passed after the class had ended, but this guy seemed to think because I had given him a ride on campus and I had been sympathetic towards him when he was harmed that I wanted to be his girlfriend or go out with him. I liked talking to him, but I had no interest in him romantically. He then started following me around. He would tell me that I was pretty. This made me feel very uncomfortable, but I thought by ignoring him that he would leave me alone. I was polite and didn't talk much though. This only seemed to encourage him even more. This went on and off for a couple months. Then school was out and I thought I wouldn't be seeing him again. I saw him a couple more times over the summertime. It was also at Woolsworth, which was the downtown area. The university was a short walk away. I realized that this guy was following me around, but I put it in the back of my mind. Then I didn't see him for a while. I figured he'd given up. It was during the time of the Olympics or in July or in August, not sure when, but I had gotten off work. I worked part-time and decided to walk to a clothing store, which is just outside the downtown area. It was about 3 p.m. I went into the store, turned around, and there he was looking at me. I pretended to be focused on looking at clothing. I went to another part of the store and he followed me, careful not to get too close, but close enough that I knew he was there. I don't remember how much time had passed, but a customer who was in the store came up to me and said, "I noticed that you are very uncomfortable, and I've noticed that there is a man following you around the store. Do you want me to have the store call police?" I said no, that I would be okay. I looked around and this guy was gone. Someone else who was in the store said he got out of there like a bat out of hell. When this customer approached me, I stayed in the store until closing, which was 5 p.m. When I went outside, I realized I had no money to call for a cab, but even if I did, I had no idea who to call. I went outside and I don't see this guy anywhere. Now I was terrified as I realized that this guy followed me to the store, and he's nowhere to be seen. Doesn't mean he's not around though. Back then everything pretty much closed down, so here I am, quite a distance from my car, and I'm really scared. There is no traffic on the road, and I'm afraid to walk on the sidewalk, fearing that this guy is gonna jump out at me or appear out of nowhere or something like that. I read everything that I could about the country and this guy came from and how women are treated, which wasn't very good at all. What the reaction of this guy would be if I regretted him or told him to get lost, something women in this country probably didn't do or are very careful about how they did this. Maybe he wouldn't have reacted, but I didn't know him well enough to predict his actions or how he viewed women. I took this into account when dealing with him. I knew if something did happen, I would probably have been blamed for it, which is why I was very, very cautious. I'm not a runner, but I ran down the middle of the street as fast as I could, and I must have had the look of terror as someone in a car, the only car that came down the street, stopped and asked me if I was okay. I said I was. I figured if he did try to approach me, I had some room between him and me to escape. I finally got to my car, looked around and underneath the car, and then got into my car and drove home. Thankfully, this guy didn't have a car, so I know that he couldn't follow me home. After that, this guy kept his distance. He didn't talk to me and stayed as far away from me as he could. I graduated in the springtime. I never seen or heard from him again. This is for the best. Stalked as a child by an Inspector Gadget lookalike pedophile. I'm currently in my 30s, and I suppose your average male living in the Midwestern United States, regular job, regular life. I simply hope for the best, try to remain positive, and try to live and let live. One thing that when brought up turns me back into a frightened 4-year-old shaking, stressed, and worried. The year was 1983. I was 4 years old, very happy and very trusting until the fateful day I was made aware of this strange, strange man. It was Thanksgiving, and we made the trip to visit my mother's side of the family. We were at her grandparents' house. At the time, I was only a child, and as a matter of fact, the only child there. I remember being bored after everyone had eaten, and asked my dad to take me to a large, well-known park in the area. I stood out due to the fact that it had giant animals that were part of the park. A penguin with a slide in its stomach, an elephant you could climb up to help with a ladder, a kangaroo that you could somehow bounce in. Anyways, you get the point. My dad jumped at the chance to get out of the house and away from everyone. He was a stranger here. These were in-laws you never really knew, cousins, aunts, uncles, great-grandparents, not to mention the friends of these people, all really tight-knit and knowing each other for years. We arrived at the park, and my first impression when pulling up was the number of kids running around. I noticed the occasional parent, as well keeping a watchful eye on their children. My dad told me that he would watch me from the car and to have fun with the other kids. I jumped out the back seat and scrambled to the penguin first. I remember bonding with the other kids. I had, of course, never met any of them before, but kids seemed to have a natural tendency to flock together, trust one another, and simply play. I was running around like most of the children, going from the slides to the swings, and eventually grew tired and sat on a bench. It had only been about 15 minutes since I had arrived, and was planning on being there for several more hours. I then noticed him, a man that stood out. I could tell even as a 4-year-old that he did not belong there. He was dressed in a trench coat, a hat that matched, and kept looking around, staring at different kids. In my childlike mind, he resembled Inspector Gadget. I knew immediately what he was up to. He was looking for an unattended child. He then eyed me, my dad being in the car several hundred yards away. He made the mistaken assumption that I had somehow, as a 4-year-old, made it to the park alone. I was then on high alert. I tried to start playing again, but all the joy of the day had been sucked out by this creep. I went down a slide only to see that he had skulked over me like a wraith, watching, waiting. I couldn't bear the tension or the fear, so I ran as fast as possible back to the safety of my father in the car. I jumped into the back seat, headed down so as to keep me hidden from his view. I told my dad I was ready to go back to my great-grandmother's house and was relieved, and we started pulling away. My curiosity took over, and I peeked my head over the back seat of the car and looked out the back window. He was there, looking directly at me and making a come here motion with his finger, all the while smiling. I ducked even lower and remained that way until we arrived back at my grandparents' home. I don't know why I didn't tell everyone what happened. Maybe I feared that it would somehow bring me closer to him, or that they wouldn't believe it. I then forgot about the strange man, or at least didn't think about it, or the fact that I would ever see him again. Flash forward to 1986. My parents and I moved into a low-rent apartment. I'm fine at first. Everything's normal. I then noticed one day that our neighbors had moved out, and that a new neighbor had moved in. One guessed as to who it was. Everything came back to me in a flash. I freaked out, but for some reason kept it all in, not saying a word to anyone. I tried to avoid him, and hoped that he would remember me from that brief moment a few years before. I was sadly mistaken. As soon as he saw me, I saw a look of recognition on his narrow face. I didn't play along after that. As a matter of fact, I didn't really go outside, really, unless my parents were there with me. Several months had passed, and of course, I was still on the defense, just waiting for the worst to happen. One day, though, I noticed something odd. He had a boy with him, roughly my age and clearly scared. The child was rarely seen, and when seen, the man had a firm grasp on him at all times. My mother, not apparently picking up on the fact that this man was a sick freak, in my mind the boogeyman, told me that I should go next door to his apartment and ask to play with what she thought was his son. Nope. Never even thought of doing such an absurd thing, and refused without telling her why. I remember seeing the boy a few more times over the course of what had to be weeks, and I always remember the look on his face, the fact that he wanted to tell me something, that he was afraid. It haunts me to this day. Even though I was just a child, I'm still filled with guilt for not saying anything. It was because I was afraid for my life, afraid of whatever the hell that strange monster of a man wanted to do to me and boys like me. I last saw the boy in the man's car. It was an old cream-colored 60s model. The boy was crying and looked out of his mind. I stored this memory away and hid it. The darkness of the moment too big for my childlike mind to understand. Eventually the beast moved away, and soon after we did as well. I was growing up. Years had passed. I was a big boy, or so I thought. 3rd grade maybe, and my parents had just taken pictures of me playing, being a kid, just regular family stuff, I guess. The man himself was lost in my memories, slowly fading, but of course never fully forgotten. The photos were developed by a local grocer. They were picked up and looked over and left on the dash of my parents' car. We went there to a park in my city. It was summertime. My parents and I got out of the car and did our tour of the park. The car windows were left down. No reason to suspect anything foul happening. I remember we were at the top of the park. on a large rocky hill, looking down. Wouldn't you know who was there? The man, dressed in a long coat again, but much shabbier, trash-eating, looking quite disheveled and dirty. I remember being afraid but happy in a strange way at seeing him so down and out, homeless and hungry. The man then saunters over to my parents' car and looks in, reaches for something, and makes off. It was the photos of May. My parents yelled and were upset, but as mentioned earlier, we were way above him. The hill we were on turned into a sheer cliff. The drop was at least 30 feet. You would have to walk completely back around to catch him. My father tried, but by the time he got to the car, the fiend was gone. My dad came back to us. We drove home. My parents chalking up to some random chance. They had no memory of this man. They only saw a mental case, homeless and lost. I processed the whole thing and freaked, knowing he was still so close. Years had gone by, and of course, naturally made me think he was long gone or dead, or at least not able to magically appear where I was and steal my photos. It was now 1989, and we live in a different house, same city. I'm much bigger and of course more aware of the world, the positives and the negatives. It was summertime. My parents had spent a late night, and their longtime friends. It was about 1 in the morning when we began to make our way back home. I was wide awake, staring out the window, eating up the world's visuals with my eyes, and all of a sudden, out of nowhere, once again dressed in the same getup as before, I almost shrieked in the back seat, but instead remained quiet and hid, praying that he didn't see me. I didn't notice, though, that he was walking rather quickly, as if he was on a mission to bring fear into the hearts of children everywhere. My parents take notice and comment on how odd it is that he's dressed in a winter coat and hat in the summertime, but don't seem to realize that this is the same man we've been seeing seemingly out of nowhere countless times before. I believe that he didn't see me, and I sat up again as we made our way up the street. We then saw her, a 13 or 14-year-old girl crying and running like her life depended on it. She kept looking back, looking for someone or something. I knew what she was looking for, and I was afraid for her. I remember my parents asking her if she needed help, a ride, etc. She flatly refused any help and kept running. I don't know what she thought we were up to, but I'm guessing whatever the man had said to her put true fear into her heart, and she wasn't going to trust anyone or anything at that moment. I never had another incident with this dark version of Inspector Gadget, and at times wonder what became of him. I sometimes feel the need to research the newspapers, internet, old phone books, anything, to discover who he was, and what he may have done to the boy I saw and maybe others. I usually begin looking, but never find anything substantial. That may be by an unconscious choice, though, as opposed to anything else. Too close. Inspector Gadget pedophile. Let's not meet ever again.